There's nothing quite as warm and inviting as hardwood floors. We'll show you how it's done coming up next on the at-home channel at Buildipedia.com. Hardwood floors are a beautiful addition to any home, and it's a job that any do-it-yourselfer can do with the right tools and a little bit of knowledge. Hi there, I'm Jeff Wilson, and today we're going to lead you through that process. We're going to install this 4-inch cherry flooring, and then we're going to sand and finish it. It's going to look beautiful. This room actually sits above a workshop that's semi-conditioned, so we wanted a little bit of insulation value and some sound deadening. We're going to use this premium underlayment, just sort of a cloth, very thin, but it'll give us a little bit of that insulation and sound deadening that we want. One of the nice things about this underlayment is it's got a self-adhesive strip. It goes down very quickly and doesn't take a lot of fasteners.
It rolls out easily and cuts with a razor knife. Then, each piece is held to the other with the adhesive strip and a plastic flap. Now be careful not to overlap the foam. Butt each piece against the other. I staple the edges around the perimeter of the room, and pretty soon I'm finishing up and I'm ready to move on to the next step.
All right, now we've got this tongue and groove flooring, which means there's a tongue on one side and a corresponding groove on the other, and they lock together. I'm going to start along this wall because this will give me the nice straight line along the kitchen tile and the bath tile here. But my first piece here butts up against the threshold piece that'll go into this bathroom. So I need to measure that and cut it and get it set in place before I can set the first piece.
It's just a matter of making the measurements and transferring the width to the table saw so that I can rip my threshold piece. I need the tongue side, so that will fit into the groove side of my first long piece. I cut it wide enough to leave a 1/4 inch gap between the edge of the wood and the bathroom tile, and I cut it to length. It fits pretty well.
I'm laying out my first piece here parallel to this interior wall and our tile installation. Since that transition from the tile to the wood is going to be very visible, I want that to be just right. Now this first piece is going to need to be face screwed down to the subfloor so that we have a nice strong base to nail against for the rest of our floor. Now when you do that, of course, you'll have holes in the top of the flooring. What we're going to do is countersink the screws quite a bit and then fill those holes with custom cherry cut plugs that'll fill the holes and make them virtually invisible when we're done finishing. So it's just a matter of installing a bunch of screws.
Installing the first piece is one of the most time-consuming, but the floor will go in quickly after this. Remember to lay out your first piece so that it's parallel with the opposite wall. That way you won't end up with a long tapered piece when you finish.
Okay, since we countersunk the screw heads using a 3/8 inch wide countersink, we're going to cut some plugs now that are 3/8 inch. I've got a 3/8 inch plug cutter, fits into your drill like this. Got a couple of spare pieces of cherry flooring. And we're just going to cut, let's see, we need 19 plugs.
The plugs cut easily, and I pop them out with a screwdriver. A drop of wood glue and a couple of taps from the hammer are all it takes to install them. Then I cut them off with a sharp chisel. Cut them slightly long and sand them flush later.
The first piece always takes the most time. Now we can move along using this flooring nailer. I've rented this today. Rents for about $35 a day. It's a pneumatic nailer that uses these L-type fasteners. It's a fastener with a serrated edge that will hold really well. Now, what we want to do is take a new piece of flooring, butt it up against the other, putting the groove on the tongue, and then we butt this up against the tongue of the new piece of flooring, strike the trigger right here with this mallet, and it'll drive the perfect fastener in at an angle and hold our piece of flooring down. Now, since we're using a 4-inch flooring, we're going to put a fastener about every 8 inches or so, and that ought to hold it.
The trick here is to make sure each piece is butted up tight before you strike the trigger. It's hard to fix a gap after you've nailed a piece in. Sometimes you'll need to persuade a slightly warped board into place. In that case, use a scrap piece of flooring as a block so that you don't damage the piece you're working on. Once you get going, it's just a matter of repeating with each new row. Hey, for a do-it-yourselfer, I'm getting pretty fast. Eventually, you'll reach the other wall. I use a series of blocks and a pry bar to get pieces into place. Since the nailer won't fit, I use finished screws in place of nails to attach them. Now, you'll likely have to rip the last pieces on your table saw, but make sure to leave a 3/8 to 1/2 inch gap at the walls for the wood to expand and contract over time.
Well, our flooring is installed and we've cleaned up a bit, we've swept, and I've gone around and I've filled some of the deeper knots and gouges with some of this cherry colored wood filler that'll be sandable. And now it is time to sand. Now a lot of people will go out and rent a drum sander and an edger, and that's perfectly acceptable. But here's a caveat. The drum sander is difficult to handle, it's very heavy, and it's very easy to gouge a floor, especially softer cherry like this. In our case, and really for a lot of people, we've only installed one room with a flooring, and it's only a little over 200 square feet. So we've opted to use a belt sander and for touch-up work, an orbital sander, a little 6-inch orbital sander. We're going to start with an 80 grit belt and then move up to a 120 grit belt, and we'll catch all of the edges the same way with our orbital sander. As with any sanding project, you want to make sure you have safety gear, goggles, ear protection, and a mask. And you'll want to drape off and tape off any area where you don't want dust, because as you can imagine, it's a dirty and dusty job.
But it's gotta be done. Working with the grain, I start with the 80 grit belts, making sure to carefully smooth out any high spots. By the way, for this job, I highly recommend a set of knee pads. After a pass with the 80 grit, I change to 100 grit and go over the floor again. Now it's important to sweep between grits to make sure you don't have any stray grit from the last pass. I make a pass with the 100 grit and again with the 120. Each time it goes faster. I do the same with the orbital sander around the edges. Then it's time to clean up all that dust, and you want to get rid of all of it. Anything left behind will end up in your finish. I even use a tack cloth to get it really clean. Now it's time for finishing. I'm going to use this oil-based high-build polyurethane in a satin. Stir it well, and I'm going to apply it using a high-quality 4-inch brush. Now this is a tip I got directly from Bruce Johnson over at Minwax. It's the best way to make sure you get a perfect coat without drips or streaks. I'll need 2 coats of this high build finish, so I sand carefully between the coats with 220 grit sandpaper, clean very well again, and recoat. The results are gorgeous.
Well, you give the poly a few days to cure before you walk on it, and at least 7 days before you move your furniture in. But this cherry floor is going to deepen and darken over time, and it's just going to become more and more beautiful. And now you know how to do it. Well, I'm Jeff Wilson. Thanks for joining me, and come back often for more how-to projects like this one on the At Home channel at Buildipedia.com.